All right, this is a really meaty topic, so I want to jump right in. We are here 60 years after Brown versus Board, and we want to talk about where we are when it comes to segregation in schools and also where we are when it comes to integration, because those aren't always necessarily the same things. So Rebecca, I want you to jump in and give us a little context on where we are. You've done a lot of research and work on this, and we should say that a lot of the work that Rebecca has done is funded by the Gates Foundation and also the Walton Family Foundation, which is both of whom are also underwriting this event.
We kind of came across the issue of modern day segregation by actually looking at the way that we fund schools. And so if you take federal funds out of the equation, schools are still funded about 50% from local property taxes and about 50% from state funds. So in essence, the amount of money that you have in your community that's driven by your property wealth is driving how much money you have for your schools. And so one of the reasons why we really wanted to focus on this is looking at Camden. So the darker school district, like right along the edge of the border, is Camden. There are 32 school districts within a 5-mile radius of Camden. So you have to ask yourself the question, how is that even possible and what's driving that? So we actually started to drill into the differences in terms of funding. So Camden is able to raise only $900 per student from their local property taxes. Haddon Township, which is one of the non-contiguous school districts about 3 miles away, raises $11,000 from their property taxes. It's impossible to think that modern day segregation, both I think socioeconomic and race-based, is not in some ways informed by the way that we fund schools. So as we started to look into the geography of school districts, we found the Birmingham, Alabama area. And the first time that my staff showed this to me, I thought, why is this picture so pixelated? This is the actual school district of Jefferson County. That's the darker green, and what Birmingham and all of the school districts around it actually look like. So we're going to be talking about the proposed red area. Still not pixelated. These are literally borders that are drawn around blocks of houses. Gardendale, Alabama, which is a community that was looking to pull away from Jefferson County, has a 7% poverty rate. To put that in perspective, that's lower than the Santa Monica, Malibu school district. And the rest of Jefferson County, their poverty is about 4 times that. But this isn't an issue that stands alone. 4 years ago, the state of Tennessee actually amended their law to allow communities to separate from their larger county-based school district. And so between 2010 and 2014, what you'll see is that there were 5 border changes. Now the county that surrounds Memphis has 6 new school districts, simply because legislators allowed for communities to pull away. The difference in poverty rate here is about 30% in Memphis, and the white district that's in the far right, Germantown, has about 4 to 5% poverty. We focus on the way that we're funding schools because there is no reason why we should be incentivizing today this kind of socioeconomic segregation.
All right, so focusing now on that map of Jefferson County, Emmanuel, I want you to talk a little bit about the work that you did, kind of drilling down into Jefferson County and talking about the story that was happening there in the school district.
Absolutely. So when I started off, I was going to tell a story about secession districts. My story was going to be about the federal government's failure to enforce the last 170 or so at this point school desegregation orders. And so what we decided to do is we wanted to zoom in on where segregation was getting worse the most rapidly. And that's how Jefferson County got on my radar. Because, I mean, when Leslie graduated from Gardendale High School in 2001, Jefferson County schools were 80% white. It was a pretty, I think there were about 25% kids who qualified for free and reduced lunch. And by the time she got back with her kids, Jefferson County had moved to Huntsville, went to college up there, stayed up there for a little while, came back in, I think, 2012.
That's about right.
About right. And it had transformed into this district that was majority Black and Latino, and about 60% of students qualified for free and reduced lunch. And what had happened over those 12 years is 2 more school districts had broken off from Jefferson County schools. So let's go back a little bit. So in Brown comes down, there are 5 school districts in Jefferson County. Immediately, 4 new school districts break off, and they form some of the wealthiest school districts in the South, actually. So they break off, and then there's a lull, and then it starts to really become popular again in the early 2000s. So yeah, we get 2 school districts break off, and each time a school district breaks off, there's even more pressure on towns like Gardendale, because, I met some people who had overtly racist feelings in Gardendale, but I met a lot of people who sort of remind me that there's a fight going on the Upper West Side of Manhattan right now, that we don't want to diversify our schools because what the effect's going to be, there are going to be less spots in the good schools for my kids. Yeah, so I think what's happening is, yes, there was some overt racism, but we've kind of really rationalized the rationing that we do, right? There are only going to be so many good schools. And what we know is the more Black and Latino kids there are in that school, it's more likely that is not going to be one of the high-performing, high-funded schools. And I really think that's what was driving Gardendale, and I think that's what's driving, we see this fight in every corner of this country at this point.
Yeah. So Leslie, I want you to talk a little bit about, so you moved back, you're with your kids, you were excited about them potentially going to the same school that you had gone to?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Tradition.
And then what happened?
Well, the fight, I guess you would per se, or the issue came up about redistricting. Gardendale wanted to have their own school system. My view on it really was, as long as you don't interrupt the feeder program that we're in, because my neighborhood is what they call unincorporated Jefferson County. So we don't really have a designated school area. The neighborhood voted years before I was even born to decide they wanted to send their children to the better school district, which was Jefferson County. So as long as, Gardendale wants to form their own system, that's fine, as long as it doesn't interrupt the pattern that has been going. The problem came for me because other people in the neighborhood had started a lawsuit once they found out about it. I just happened to come in on the later end. Once I heard, they're going to cut us out. Why? I said, no, that wouldn't make sense. I said, of course, we should have some type of preference to be grandfathered in, especially if you have family that, attended the school. I thought, well, let me go to these meetings and see what they're talking about. And it seemed like over time, the narrative changed. Of course, North Smithfield, which is the neighborhood I live in, will be included. Well, you may only get in for 13 years, and after that, your neighborhood will be out. And again, we didn't think that was fair because this program has been going on for a while. Why would you try to change something now? But it's not racism. It's not racist. It's more of an economic thing. I almost would have said that until the other neighborhoods, Mount Olive, there's a couple of other neighborhoods that were also in the same feeder program. They were majority white, but you were cutting them out as well. But because I felt like they weren't up to the socioeconomic standard, you wanted a financial base there. We didn't fill in that gap. But you have people, again, our neighbors have gone there for years. You have whole families that were basically getting ripped apart because you had half of them that, attended the school. You have those who moved back to this area to go to this school. And the way they were cutting or redistricting, you could tell those were the upper ends of the city. And that was the problem for us. Right. It's like you're going to cut us out, but you're not giving us a good reason. And the options that they offered our children to go to school, these are schools that were badly in need of repair. There were good teachers there, of course, at the other schools, but you think our kids are bused to school. You're going to take a potentially 10 to 15 minute bus ride and turning it into almost a 30-minute bus ride.
Yeah.
In schools that are, again, like I said, overcrowded. So you can't hold the capacity of your own students there. How are you going to fit ours in there? And they just weren't really giving solid answers. You were giving the politically correct answer. It has nothing to do with this. It has nothing to do with that. Yet, social media is a wonderful tool because there are people that were so brave to put it on social media.
Yeah.
You put posts up and you read the comments, but we didn't say that.
Yeah. Can I ask you how it felt going to those meetings and hearing people say essentially that they didn't want kids who were your kids to be in the same schools?
It was kind of hard because it's 2018. It feels like we're repeating time, just a whole new generation. However, we're more vocal in this generation. We're not just going to, okay, well, we'll have to do something. No, we're more open with our feelings just as everyone else seems to be more open with theirs.
Emmanuel and Rebecca, so Emmanuel, you said you started this conversation or this inquiry kind of thinking about how federally ordered desegregation was being enforced or not. So now under the new administration, or not so new administration, the Trump administration, how are these things going to be enforced or not, do you think?
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard to say at this point. I have heard of a few school districts in Mississippi, and I think I've been tipped off to one in Alabama that this is going to be the time. Like, if you can get out of your deseg order, this is probably the best time to go. Because, so what was happening under the Obama administration is essentially the Obama administration would negotiate this really extensive, long consent decree. And you would have to check off a bunch of boxes, like my black and white suspension rates are going to look about the same. Now, I know there was a district in Mississippi that got out from under order. And they essentially, there was a settlement agreement, and that's it. Like, oversight's gone. So I do think it'll be easier. But I think with a lot of these districts, like I talked to a few districts that like the superintendent had no idea they were still under court order. So I don't see them going up to the federal courthouse in, I don't know, Tuscaloosa and being like, you know what, it's time now, because it's not even a thing on their radar.
I think one of the important things to note, though, is that a lot of education policy is driven at the state level. And so there have been 71 school districts that have pulled away from their largest school districts since 2000. There are 30 states that actually have a law on the books that allow this to happen. In some cases, they have a manual that they publish to talk about how you can create your own school system. Only of those 30 states, only 9 of them mandate that there be any consideration for a difference in socioeconomics or a difference in funds, and only 5 require that there's a review of what is going to happen, how it's going to affect racial demographics. 5 out of 30. And so, we're giving folks basically the incentive to pull away from their school districts by allowing them to keep their property taxes. And we're permitting it at the state level, and in some cases even encouraging it.
So I want to talk a little bit about how widespread this is. We've talked about a lot of places in the South, and I think when a lot of people think about desegregation orders, they think about the South, they think about portions of the Midwest. You mentioned the Upper West Side, and Nicole Hannah-Jones has, of course, talked a lot about what's happening in Brooklyn. But where is this everywhere, or is it in small pockets? Is it just in the South? What are we talking about here?
I mean, so, and you could speak to this probably better, but like the secession movement is in the South heavily because there are these big county-wide school districts, right? So like this already happened in the North. Like you look at like the map you showed of Camden County, like there are already 1 million school districts. So they're less concerned about sort of hoarding resources and hoarding their own property taxes. Right, there's the bill in North Carolina that's currently, I don't know what's happening with that.
So I think that the legislature did not allow that proposal to move forward. So this is, again, talking about state level policy. So North Carolina was trying to go the way of Tennessee and basically change their law in order to allow for a wealthy school district to pull out of one of the county school districts. I think that it's only because of the voices of Emmanuel and some of the other journalists that have kind of brought this to light that there's actually a new level of scrutiny on what legislatures are doing around this issue. But again, 71 school districts have been created since 2000, largely in the South. But we're talking about, in some cases, Malibu is trying to pull out of Santa Monica. And so you've got like the very rich trying to secede from the somewhat rich, right? And so this isn't just an issue that is driven largely socioeconomically. It is driven by the fact that we put incentives in the system to keep your own property wealth.
Yeah. I want to let our audience know that we are going to come to you for questions. If you can start thinking about them now, condensing them down, making sure that they are questions, and we'll have mic runners so you can get those hands high after I have one or two more questions for our panel. So, Leslie, the secession didn't work, right? It failed.
It failed.
But I'm wondering, do you feel like that's the end? Do you feel like the conversation is over and everything is unified and welcoming and
No.
back to normal?
No, I don't feel like that's the end. I feel like it's a pause. Because right now they have other issues to deal with because they raised taxes for the school district that did not form. So they have other things on that end that they have to handle. But I think the biggest effect of it is open the door, and now you feel the difference. And it probably was unintentional, but unfortunately, you can tell. Now you know. It's like now I know how you feel about me, essentially, not me as a person, but you personify it for yourself. Now I know how you feel about me, and I'm supposed to continue to be educated and work, and we coexist. But I know that deep down at the heart of it, if you could have, we wouldn't even be together. So it makes you a little more cautious. It's more of certain things that I have to teach my children now. Of course, we're all human. And I try to teach my children that we don't do color. That's one thing. I don't like my children to identify a person by color. If you see a woman, tell me something else. Don't tell me what that white, like, no, give me something else. Then I try to not distinguish that. But now, here it is, black and white, internationally known, that there are those who stand beside you, who attend classes with you every day, that someone didn't like you for a reason of something that is completely out of our control.
One of the other things that I think is really important is that Gardendale wasn't allowed to happen because they're still under federal desegregation orders. Alabama has one of the most permissive laws on the books that allow school districts or wealthy folks to pull themselves out of larger school districts. The federal court said that Gardendale couldn't secede right now because there is a desegregation order. The big question is, once there is no federal oversight, will the state step in and not allow this to happen? And I think that we all know that the answer is no.
Well, that gets to my next question, which is, so we're 60 years out, as we mentioned at the top of this. So when you think about 20 years from now, 50 years from now, what do schools in America look like? Are they more segregated? Are they less segregated? Emmanuel, I'm going to you first.
Honestly, I'm not optimistic. You look at, you're right, exactly. Like the federal courts, which will probably not have any say at that point, or have been the only check here. Like there's a community, Bevel Oaks, Texas, that just like after decades and their deseg order expired, was able to switch out from Beaumont Public Schools, which is a super diverse district, and go to an all-white district. Like the Texas State legislature had no problem with that. So, yes, I think we're going to see more segregation. And I think the question will become, like, are there tools we can use at the state level to erase some of these disparities?
And I've been sitting here saying that one tool is fixing the way that we fund schools. I mean, so long as you can keep your property taxes, you can't blame parents from saying in some cases, I want to keep my taxes to my children and my schools. What we have is a broken system that is providing the incentive to do that. And so once you can take this notion that I just want to keep my own tax dollars out of the equation, then it becomes very obvious why folks are seceding. Until that point, until we get the issue of funding out of the equation, there's always going to be communities that can say, look, this is tax driven, this is money driven. And so fixing the way that we fund schools is, I think, absolutely essential. It is one of the kind of foundational issues of fixing this issue.
Leslie, do you think things are going to get better or worse?
I'm going to have to agree with the consensus that at the rate things are going, it's possible to get worse. Not like she said, funding is a component of it, but also something else that I learned. There are other factors that play into it because, okay, you have communities that can fund their own schools, but there are communities that minorities can't even get to. We would love to move into certain areas, but let's face it, housing, loans, things like that, us to get the finances to move to these districts, we don't have the access to, and that's, again, systematic for years. Redlining has been going on for years. It's not as obvious now because you have maybe a little bit more diversity in certain communities, but let's be honest, in certain communities, I don't know how you got in there. It's the luck of the draw. You will let so many, but you have to have, certain qualifications. That one little mistake from your younger years is preventing you from now. So I would love to say it could get better, but if, again, the current administration, the system as it is now, unless it is completely overhauled and redone, no, I don't see it getting any better because, like you said, they're just now we have the means to fund our own schools.
Yeah, maybe the solution isn't in the schools, right? Like the Fair Housing Act has pretty affirmative language about we need to dismantle segregation. So maybe residential segregation and some sort of rethinking of the social contract is on the horizon. But
Do you think enforcement of fair housing is going to go very
Not
far in the next
soon.
few years?
No. Yeah.
All right, I want the audience to have a chance to ask some questions. I see some hands way in the back there.
Good morning. My name is C.G. Dodds, and I'm an attorney and professor at UDC School of Law. And I wanted to ask the panelists if you have ever thought about pursuing a long-term strategy to this issue, particularly to the issue of school equity funding. Although there is Supreme Court precedent in San Antonio v. Rodriguez that says that funding is not a grounds for funding as far as property taxes is still permissible. However, there's been subsequent, not Supreme Court cases, but federal and state cases that have found that that is a grounds for inequitable distribution and disparate impact. Therefore, instead of focusing on these desegregation orders that are archaic and structurally unsound, have you thought about focusing on a long-term approach that actually attacks the legal foundation of equity funding in schools?
So, I mean, just kind of going back to the idea that a lot of education policy is driven at the state level, it's the states that come up with the funding formula. The federal government doesn't have a say in it because of San Antonio. I think one of the really important things to point out here, though, is that there's this kind of hidden Supreme Court decision, Milliken v. Bradley. And what the Supreme Court basically said is that if there is a line that is drawn between school districts, for whatever reason that line is drawn, we cannot mandate desegregation across those lines. That then gave power to school district borders. And so, yes, I think absolutely changing the way that we fund schools and making sure that states don't give the incentive to segregate because we're relying heavily on local property taxes is really important. But we're never going to actually kind of solve this issue of racial and socioeconomic segregation until we actually go back, I think, to Milliken.
All right, and do we have another one right over there?
Hi, my name is Jenny Abambo. I am a reporter with EdSearch, and I had a question. Emmanuel, you made a quote. You said a quote a little earlier that kind of disturbed me a little bit, just because it felt like it was hanging. About Black and students of color having lower performance in general in schools whenever you kind of go into a place. And I was curious about the framing of this segregation conversation, because sometimes it kind of feels that this framing hovers around asking rich, wealthy white parents to sacrifice for poor Black kids. And I'm wondering, as journalists kind of thinking about storytelling around this issue, is it always just a case of them sacrificing? There are lots of studies about benefits to diverse schools, lots of things around that area. What can we do to change this framing a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's tough because the thing is like if we're always just going to paint it as like diversity is great and like, I know like there's so many upper middle class white parents who love diversity and like, but that's not going to solve the systemic issue of like, on the Upper West Side, right? Like it spans Harlem in the Upper West, or District 3 spans Harlem in the Upper West Side. And there's just no interest at this point beyond diversity. And that's just not going to get us to a place of equity, I think.
All right. Audience, please join me in thanking our panelists.